The federal government tells us that by the time a child reaches the age of 18, it will have a 1 out of every 2 chance of being on food stamps. So the federal government itself is telling us that half of all children will be on food stamps by the time they reach the age of 18.
44% of single mothers in America are on food stamps, yet struggle to put food on the table.
One of the things I found as I traveled around was just the sheer enormity of this, that this is a problem that is probably the single greatest economic challenge facing America, the vast numbers cascading into poverty.
This map was created by Kaiser Family Foundation and shows the distribution of total population by federal poverty level in 2014. The United States Census Bureau states that in 2014 the official poverty rate was 14.8%. That's 46.7 million people living in poverty. When looking at children under 18, the poverty rate was 21.1%. We asked fellow educators working in Title I schools what it was like growing up in poverty.
Well, I would say I was low middle class. We were poor, but I didn't know it till I got older. Definitely lots of friends that lived around me didn't have as much as I did, so they were definitely in poverty. Even then I could tell they were.
It's hard to describe my background because at the time that I'm living it, it was my normal, and I didn't feel like it was necessarily abnormal to not have things. It wasn't until I got older or, started comparing myself to my peers or experiencing things like being picked on for having clothes that were obviously used or, very out of date, that I realized that I did not have things because as much as possible my mom tried to shield my brother and I from knowing what this was. So I never felt like I necessarily missed out, but I definitely knew that I didn't have. And it came down to sometimes where I couldn't do things where other people, I couldn't go on field trips or I couldn't pay for this. Like people have the luxury now, and I see it as a teacher in high school, see students that buy snacks all day. I didn't have that luxury. I didn't have food to eat at home, let alone money to go to school to buy things other than free lunch. There were times where we didn't necessarily have food to eat, or we didn't absolutely have food to eat, but we've always had a place to sleep. We've always had shelter. I was always safe, but it was just the lack of resources at times.
The Voices of Poverty is a website showing many faces of American hunger.
God only knows how I survived with 3 girls, a 2-bedroom apartment, and trying to keep food in their mouths. Sometimes I go without eating just to feed them.
We then asked our interviewees if they felt that growing up in poverty affected their strive for higher education.
Well, some of my friends, they did drop out, but the ones that did go through, they got jobs that, whereas now we would have to go to trade schools to do, they would go straight into these jobs and get higher paying jobs and work their way up. My brother, who quit school, could take anything apart, and he got into maintenance, but now you couldn't do that same job because you have to have training. And now he makes as much as I do without a college education, which stinks. But me, personally, I saw my parents come home after working 12-hour shifts, night shifts, and they were exhausted. They hated their job. It wore their bodies down physically. And I did not want that. And so I was going to go to school. And I was on welfare. I was a single mom. I got on welfare. I lived in government housing, food stamps. So I was definitely in poverty at age 18. But I continued. They had programs then where they would pay me so much money for my daycare, so much money for my lunches. And I worked, and it took me 8 years to get a 4-year degree, but I finished. And then that's just took me a long time.
The lack of resources has definitely impacted my educational goals. Because I lived in poverty, I knew I had to go to college, whereas others in my situation, it felt as though going straight into the workforce and making money right away would be the best way to help themselves and their family. But I know that in the long run, you have to work so much harder for so much longer and not get the same results. So I can kind of, to a certain extent, attribute my level of poverty to my level of success in college. I knew that I needed to make money, and so I was determined to cut those 4 years down and to graduate as soon as possible. So I made it a point not to play around or mess up in school. And I knew that I had to go on to better myself. So I knew basically poverty just made college more real for me rather than less of an attainable goal.
Well, my parents kind of left it up to me to do how well I did in school. My friends, you know, they were uneducated. Their parents were uneducated, so they begat uneducated children. It was not a priority in their houses. It wasn't a priority in my house either. But because I was just intrinsically motivated, I think that's where I got. Because my brother, he quit school at 16 because education wasn't important. Not at all. And everything that I needed for school, whether it be school clothes, school supplies, I always felt like it was a burden to my parents. Even though, you know, they did it anyways, I always knew that it put them in a bind financially. Any other extra spending did not fit the budget because everything was just so tight.
On one hand, not having money growing up made me sure of the fact that I wanted to go to college and further my education, but on the other hand, not having money almost led me to not go into the field of education. Once I told my mom that I wanted to become a teacher, she cried because as a student I had always excelled in the areas of math and science. She always saw that my future would lead me into something like becoming a pharmacist or a doctor, something money making, because we're told from a young age that math and science is where the money are. However, I wanted to teach, and given from my now personal experience and what we knew back then, teachers don't make a lot of money. They're unappreciated. And given what she felt as being talents, math and science, I could have gone on to do something better.
This Week in Education from Princeton Community Television did an interview with Ruby Payne, who is the author of Framework for Understanding Poverty, to discuss how poverty truly affects education.
One study they did in the University of Missouri, Kansas City, they put tape recorders in homes by economic class.
Oh, yeah?
And what they found, children between the ages of 1 and 3, they did not, in 3 years, they heard 13 million words total. In a working class household, they heard 26 million words. Now, these are not different words, these are total.
Okay.
But in a professional household, some level of education beyond high school, they heard 45 million words. And they found that a 3-year-old in a professional household has more vocabulary than an adult in a welfare household. Standardized test questions tend to be looked at for racial bias, but not for economic bias.
Right.
And they're unbelievably biased. For example, this was a question that was on the Texas State Assessment for 3rd graders. Describe your closet in detail.
Describe your closet in detail.
Number 1, that assumes you have a closet.
Right.
That you're not homeless. That you now aren't moving. Okay. Number 2, it assumes there's something in it.
Well, I feel like if the basic needs aren't being met, they're not going to be studying school. School is not important. If you can't get fed, you can't get clothes, you can't get shoes, or even eyeglasses. If your basic needs aren't being met, then you can't focus on what's going on. And you don't really care either, because you're sitting there starving to death or whatever, you know?
This New York school is one of many where more than half of students are eligible for free lunches in order to ensure the kids get at least one proper meal a day.
I see their drive, and that's what I encounter a lot, is that the students who have the most, who have essentially nothing to lose, try the hardest. I look around my classroom and my students who are definitely lacking have definitely been some of my students that have persevered more.